AI cracked the language of whales, and what they're saying is chilling. In the summer of 2023, a group of scientists sat in a lab staring at a screen full of clicking sounds turned into pictures, and one of them said something that made the whole room go quiet. This isn't random. This looks like grammar. They weren't talking about a human recording. They were talking about a sperm whale, 1,000 feet below the surface of the Caribbean Sea, clicking to another whale in the dark. For over 2 centuries, we told ourselves a comforting story, that we were the only species on this planet with something worth calling language. Whales made sounds, sure. Beautiful ones. Haunting ones. But sounds we assumed, not sentences. That assumption is now falling apart, and the machine that's tearing it down was never built to talk to animals at all. Stick around, because by the end of this you're going to understand why some of the researchers who built this technology say they're not entirely sure they want to know what happens when we finally understand what's being said down there. For most of human history, whales were valuable to us for exactly one reason: what could be taken from their bodies? Oil for lamps, bone for corsets, blubber rendered down into industrial grease. Entire ports were built on the whaling trade. Fortunes were made and lost chasing these animals across oceans, and in that entire relationship, spanning hundreds of years, nobody paused to wonder whether the low, rolling moan a whale let out as a harpoon boat closed in might have meant something more specific than pain. We were too busy measuring their length, their weight, the volume of oil a single carcass could yield. Even the naturalists who admired whales, who wrote pages of awe about their size and their grace, tended to stop at the surface. A heart the size of a small car. A tongue that could weigh as much as an elephant. These were the facts that made it into the record. What almost never made it into the record was the possibility that behind those ancient eyes sat a mind doing something we would recognize, if we ever bothered to listen properly, as thought. That began to shift, slowly and almost by accident, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when researchers first lowered hydrophones into warm Pacific and Atlantic waters and started recording humpback whales. What came back through the headphones didn't match anything in the textbooks. These weren't random moans. They were organized. Individual sounds repeated in clusters, clusters repeated in patterns, and those patterns built into extended sequences that could run for 20 or 30 minutes before looping back to the start. Researchers started calling them songs, and the label turned out to be more literal than anyone expected because the songs changed over time. A population of humpbacks would sing one version one year, and by the next season, they'd all be singing a slightly different one, an update that spread through the group the way a new phrase spreads through a group of friends. That kind of shared, evolving structure doesn't look like instinct. Instinct is fixed. What the researchers were hearing looked like the early outline of culture, and when a recording of those songs was released to the public, people didn't just find it interesting, they found it moving. That single album is credited with helping turn public opinion against commercial whaling and contributing to protections that pulled several species back from the edge of extinction. The sound alone did that. But knowing that the sound was beautiful and knowing what the sound meant turned out to be 2 completely different problems, and for the next 50 years, the second problem barely budged. The field that grew up around it is called bioacoustics, and for decades it was a slow, patient, almost monastic discipline. Scientists spent years with headphones clamped to their ears, replaying the same clips over and over, trying to catch a repeated shape by memory alone. It's grinding work, and human attention has limits. A researcher gets tired. A researcher's ear drifts. And even when a pattern was found, when someone could say, yes, this whale makes this specific run of clicks, and that whale answers with something similar, the next question was always the same one, and it was the one nobody could answer. So what does it mean? Is it a name? A warning? A location? Something we don't have a word for, because nothing in human experience maps onto it? The recordings piled up for decades. What never arrived was a key. The person who eventually reframed the entire problem was a marine biologist named David Gruber, and his shift in thinking wasn't a new gadget, it was a change in the question being asked. Gruber had spent enough time on the water watching sperm whales move together, adjusting their behavior in ways that looked coordinated across distances too great for sight to explain, that he couldn't shake the feeling he was watching a conversation he simply didn't have the tools to hear. And instead of building a better microphone, he looked somewhere nobody in marine biology had thought to look, toward the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. For decades, radio astronomers had built entire mathematical frameworks around one very specific problem. How do you detect a message inside a stream of data when you and the sender share no language, no biology, and no assumptions at all? How do you tell a signal from noise when the source is completely alien to you? Gruber's insight was that this exact toolkit, built for a search that had never actually found anything, was sitting and used right next to a species that might have been trying to be heard the whole time, not from another star, but from 3,000 feet down in our own ocean. Out of that idea came a research effort that eventually became known as Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, and its goal was stated plainly from the beginning, not just to listen to whales, but to work toward understanding the structure of what they were saying, and eventually to try to hold something resembling a two-way exchange. It's one of the most ambitious things attempted in the history of animal communication research, and it ran headfirst into a problem that had defeated every effort before it. Talking to a sperm whale is, by almost any measure, one of the hardest communication challenges you could choose. These animals spend most of their lives at depths no diver can reach and no camera can easily follow. They surface for a few minutes, then vanish again into total darkness for the better part of an hour. You can't hand a whale a microphone. You can't ask it to repeat a sound more slowly. You often can't even be certain which whale in a group made a given click or which whale it was meant for. Every advantage a human researcher normally relies on, watching a face, seeing where attention is directed, sharing a physical space, disappears the moment you enter their world. So the first real decision the project had to make wasn't about algorithms at all. It was about geography, because if researchers couldn't follow whales into the deep, they needed a place where the deep essentially came to the surface for them. That place turned out to be the small volcanic island of Dominica, in the eastern Caribbean. A mile or two off its coast, the seafloor doesn't gently taper away the way it does off most coastlines. It drops almost straight down into water thousands of feet deep. That means the deep-diving habitat sperm whales need is close enough to shore that a small research boat can reach it in minutes rather than days. And Dominica has something else going for it. A resident population of sperm whales that doesn't just pass through, it stays, generation after generation, in the same stretch of water. That gave researchers something almost unheard of in marine biology, the chance to know individual whales, not as data points, but as members of families they could track over years. Long before any of the artificial intelligence work began, a biologist named Shane Jarrow had already spent more than a decade doing exactly that, sitting in a small boat off Dominica, learning to recognize sperm whales the way you'd learn to recognize the people in an extended family. He gave them names, tracked which calves belonged to which mothers, watched young whales learn to dive and hunt, and stay close to their family units. That decade of patient, unglamorous observation turned out to matter enormously later, because the AI systems the project eventually built were only ever going to be as useful as the data fed into them, and raw sound without context is just noise. Knowing that a particular click sequence came from a specific whale, the daughter of a specific matriarch, recorded while her family unit was gathered at the surface after a long dive, is the kind of detail no algorithm can invent on its own. It has to come from years of a human being simply paying attention. To actually gather usable data at scale, the team built something that hadn't existed before, a permanent underwater listening network anchored to the seafloor off Dominica, an array of hydrophones spread across a wide area of ocean floor and left running continuously, day and night, capturing every click that passed through. A single hydrophone can tell you a sound happened. An array of them, spaced in a known pattern, can do something far more useful, because sound reaches each microphone at a very slightly different instant. By measuring those tiny timing differences, the team could work backward and pinpoint, in 3 dimensions, almost exactly where in the water a click originated. That meant they weren't just recording a wall of noise anymore. They could tell which whale, at which depth, made a given sound, and which other whales were close enough to hear it. For the first time, researchers could watch something that looked like the shape of a conversation forming in real time, rather than just a chorus rising out of the dark. Knowing who made a sound only solves half the puzzle, though. The harder half is figuring out why a whale made it, and that meant the sound alone was never going to be enough. A run of clicks made during a deep hunting dive might mean something completely different from an almost identical run made while a whale rests near the surface with a calf beside it. So the engineering side of the project turned to something surprisingly gentle: small tags, held on with suction cups rather than anything that pierces the skin, designed to ride along on a whale's back for a day or two before releasing and floating up for retrieval. These tags recorded the whale's own vocalizations from the inside of its world, but also its heart rate, its pitch and roll, the angle and depth of every dive. For the first time, a specific click pattern could be matched not just to the whale that made it, but to exactly what that whale's body was doing in the same moment: a hunting dive with a racing pulse, or a calm, resting exchange at the surface with a slow, steady heartbeat. That gave the data something it had always been missing: context. By 2020, the project had drawn serious funding, and the scale of what it could collect exploded, from a lifetime's worth of scattered recordings to a continuously growing archive running into the hundreds of millions of vocalizations, by far the largest library of sperm whale sound ever assembled. That scale matters because modern machine learning tends to find structure that's invisible in a small dataset the moment it has enough examples to compare. To make that structure visible, researchers converted the recordings into spectrograms, visual maps that plot pitch against time, so that a click sequence becomes something you can actually look at: a landscape of ridges and gaps and repeating shapes rather than an undifferentiated stream of taps. Machine learning models were then trained on these images with no answer key at all, simply told to find whatever regular structure existed in the data on its own. What the models found was a system considerably richer than the simple catalog of a few dozen distinct call types that researchers had documented by ear over the previous decades. The click sperm whales make, known as codas, turned out to combine small building blocks, rhythm, tempo, and tiny pitch changes called rubato and ornamentation, that whales appear to vary and recombine in ways that produce a far larger repertoire of distinct signals than anyone had cataloged by ear. In a 2024 analysis, the SETI team described this as something closer to a combinatorial system, a kind of phonetic alphabet where a fairly small set of components can be arranged and rearranged into many distinct messages, in the same rough way that human languages build enormous vocabularies out of a limited set of sounds. Here's where it's important to slow down and be precise, because this is the point where a lot of headlines run past the actual science. No research team, including the one behind this project, has translated whale communication. Nobody has produced a dictionary. Nobody has proven that these codas carry meaning in the way human words do, only that they show a level of structural complexity, combination, and variation that genuinely surprised the scientists studying them, and that had not been documented in a non-human species at this scale before. What's real is the structure. What's still unknown, and openly acknowledged as unknown by the researchers themselves, is whether that structure encodes something we'd recognize as content, ideas, names, warnings, relationships, or something else we don't yet have a framework for. Some of the scientists involved have been careful to say exactly that in interviews, that finding pattern is not the same as finding meaning, and that the responsible next step is more data and more testing, not premature claims of a breakthrough in translation. And that's really the uneasy part, the part that sits with you after the cameras stop rolling. For most of history, the line separating us from every other species on Earth was language, a complex, rule-based, endlessly combinable system that let us build everything from poetry to physics. If it turns out that a similarly rule-based, combinable system has been running in parallel beneath the waves for millions of years, generation after generation, family line after family line, passed down the way a mother teaches a calf to dive, then the line we drew around ourselves gets a lot blurrier than we ever expected it to be. Not because whales are secretly reciting philosophy in the dark. We don't know that, and anyone who tells you they do is getting ahead of the evidence. But because the tool we always use to prove our own uniqueness, the sheer complexity of language, no longer looks like something only we possess. So here's the actual question worth sitting with, the one without a tidy answer yet. If an animal has spent millions of years building a structured way of passing information between individuals, between families, across generations, in a medium we spent most of our history treating as empty background noise, what do we owe it now that we're finally capable of listening properly? Not answers. Not certainty. Just the willingness to keep listening honestly, including to what the scientists themselves are still saying they don't know. That, more than any dramatic claim of translation, is the real story here, and it's still being written, 1,000 feet down, in the dark, right now. If this kind of thing fascinates you, stick around, because there's a lot more happening in the ocean than we've ever given it credit for, and we're only just starting to listen.